The various events that took place towards the end of last year and the 3 days of pre-season testing gave F1 fans and pundits alike many reasons to be very excited for the upcoming 2021 Formula 1 season, with analysts and experts in their slightly oversized glasses predicting that it would be one of the closest seasons in years. But the season opener in Bahrain caused F1 fans to wonder, do we actually want close racing? Or do we just want Lewis Hamilton to lose? Because in a season full of change, with Daniel in orange, Carlos in red, Vettel in green and Schumacher in Russia, we were greeted with the same winner we were used to for so many years now, and the same 3 drivers on the podium that we were used to for the whole of last year as well. Lewis Hamilton won that race that he really shouldn't have, by less than a second, hence proving those buffoons that were saying Hamilton wasn't worth the money, and instead give the seat to a driver that scored just 2 points in his F1 career, were talking even more rubbish than what was found in Fernando Alonso's brake ducts. So how did he do it? How did Red Bull lose it? And what does this mean as we all head to Imola for the second race? Oh, hang on. Are you actually being serious? 3 weeks, F1? Okay, what does it mean as we go to the next race, which is an even longer break than it was from testing to the first race, then? Video, and all those questions will be answered in this video. So let's go. The race started off with the deployment of the safety car because of a crash for thumb-faced Russian lout Nikita Mazepin. Given his on-track adventures in F1 so far this year, and Haas's poor record in the opening race of the season, this felt kind of predictable. Mazepin was one of 3 F1 rookies this year, and was having his first ever experience of an F1 weekend, and boy did it show. Over the course of the weekend, he had at least 5 spins. That averages out at a spin in every single session. The guy said that he's going to let his performances on track do the talking, which was ironic because when he was in the car, he seemed to spend more time off the track than on it. He's navigating his way through the first few corners of the race, and as he said on the radio, he was so close to making contact with his teammate Mick Schumacher. And in trying to avoid him, he got on the curb, which, just like Andrea Duval's breasts, he made too much contact with. Only this time he actually faced the consequences for his actions and crashed after completing the same amount of corners as formation laps. Honestly, off-track activities aside, it kind of baffles me as to why people think this guy's actually any good. Now last year he finished 5th place in Formula 2. Now usually when I compare drivers' performances in F2, I compare their first season, because obviously some people only spend 1 year in F2. And it's pretty common for a driver to have a big improvement from their first season of F2 to their second. Now Nikita Mazepin in his first season of Formula 2 finished in 18th place, whilst driving with all the awareness of a chimpanzee, which for an F1 driver is pretty terrible. The only driver on the current grid that gets close to that is Nicholas Latifi, and the last F1 driver to finish that low in their first year of F2 was Jolyon Palmer, and throughout testing he was consistently losing control at the most minor direction changes. The only thing less consistent than his throttle application was the rulebook regarding track limits. Honestly, this guy makes Jack Aitken look as good as Damon Hill, he makes Pietro Fittipaldi look as good as Emerson Fittipaldi, and he makes Alex Albon look as good as people actually think he is. However, I don't think Haas will be disappointed with Mazepin's crash, as much as they're delighted that Mick Schumacher didn't stuff it in the wall in the resulting safety car. Because this isn't just what Haas are known for, this is what Haas do. This is their 6th year in F1, and if you hadn't already worked out by now, that means that before this year, they'd had 5 opening races. 5 races times 2 drivers means that before this year, they've entered 10 cars in the opening races of an F1 season. And of those 10 cars, only 2 have finished. Haas's record at opening races is worse than their driver's reputation, and as such, Mick Schumacher became only the 3rd driver ever to finish a race for Haas in the opening weekend. But that almost wasn't the case, as just after the restart for that safety car, Mick Schumacher then spun at turn 4. To be honest, the only reason he didn't crash as well is because there wasn't a wall there for him to crash into, which meant that he could continue, as would the battle for the lead. Now it didn't take long to realise what the Mercedes strategy was, with Lewis Hamilton pitting at the end of lap 13. This is a very early stop, especially considering 3 of those laps were under safety car, but it was fairly obvious what the Mercedes strategy was. They wanted to take the lead of the race as early as possible and control the race from there. Probably because the Mercedes has traditionally struggled more than others in the dirty air, with their tight packaging leading them susceptible to overheating, making it very difficult for them to follow other cars. The best way to get around this was to get in the lead at all costs, such as pitting early so that they wouldn't have to follow anyone. That it would be impossible for Red Bull to see it coming and therefore react to it, and by the time they could have reacted to it, it was too late. When Hamilton pitted, he was 1.7 seconds behind Verstappen, and he gained most of that time in just the middle sector of his outlap. So Red Bull definitely made the right decision in keeping Verstappen out there, because if they did decide to pit, he would be behind Hamilton anyway, and he'd be in his dirty air with tyres that were only a lap fresher than Hamilton's, so not really worth it. So Red Bull made the right decision in sticking to their original strategy, which when Verstappen made his pit stop allowed him to catch Hamilton on fresher tyres. This led to Mercedes calling Hamilton in for a second pit stop at the end of lap 28. It didn't matter that there was still half the race to go and that Hamilton felt he could have gone longer on the tyres. Verstappen had got to within 2 seconds of him and therefore had a slight chance of an undercut. So as soon as he got into undercut window, Mercedes pitted Hamilton because they wanted to keep the lead. They then pitted Valtteri Bottas just a few laps later, the idea being that Verstappen would have to pit in response, otherwise he would also lose track position to Bottas, which would limit the tyre advantage and therefore how quickly he could catch Lewis after he made his second pit stop, and effectively force Red Bull to pit when Mercedes wanted them to. And to be honest, this would have worked if Bottas had actually been served by the Mercedes mechanics and not the Ferrari mechanics just dressed up in black. This is the sort of stuff that Mercedes can afford to try given they have 2 cars at the sharp end of the grid, and it's a luxury that Red Bull have never really had in the turbo hybrid era. But they'll hope that they do have that this year with their second driver, Sergio Perez. This weekend it wasn't quite to be, as his weekend was messed up right from qualifying, with Red Bull making what was actually a very similar mistake they made in Pierre Gasly's first qualifying session for Red Bull 2 years ago. Although this wouldn't actually matter, as his car ended up grinding to a halt on the formation lap, forcing him to start from the pit lane. From here, he didn't quite hit the heights he hit in Sakir, where he came from the back to take a stunning victory for Racing Point, this time finishing only P5 over 50 seconds off the lead. However, this was still a very solid drive from Checo, and it was the sort of performance that the more and more I think about it, the more I realise how good it actually was. This track is clearly one of his best, scoring a podium for Force India in 2014, and what would have been another podium here last year had it not been for an engine failure with 4 laps to go. As we know, Checo specialises in looking after his rear tyres, and at a track where looking after the rear tyres is more important than money is to Haas, it's not a surprise that he usually goes well here. He used his superb tyre management skills to eke out his tyre stints and give himself fresher tyres for the end of the race, which he used to good effect, passing the likes of Sainz, Ricciardo and Leclerc, finishing in P5. What makes this drive especially impressive is that he was one of the few drivers that was actually regularly behaving themselves in turn 4, and stopping out on track in the formation lap actually hindered his race in more ways than the obvious one, which was that he lost 8 positions, because the rest of the grid then had to complete another formation lap, but because Perez was forced to start the race from the pit lane, he wasn't, meaning that he was carrying an extra lap of fuel for the entire race. This may not have made a huge difference, but it certainly didn't help him. But considering this, and the fact that the Red Bull handles completely differently to the Racing Point, pit lane to P5 on your debut is a very solid result. A man that probably would have been fighting around there had it not been for his mistake was Pierre Gasly. Gasly was on the medium tyres, set up very well for the race, so this would have been a very frustrating moment for him. The soft tyres were clearly warming up faster than the mediums, hence why Leclerc managed to pass Bottas with such ease. But once the medium was up to temperature, it was lasting a fair bit longer than the softs. So if Gasly just held his position, he would have been in a very good position to put pressure on the guys in front of him later in the stint, and then go a lot longer into the race than those guys. Yes, the soft tyres were better in that moment, but there was a reason that everyone that had the luxury of choosing the tyres chose to go with the mediums over the softs, and Pierre would have done well to remember that. This was the sort of race where patience would be rewarded, as shown by Sergio Perez, and if Gasly had shown more of this, he would have been in a very good position to repeat his P4 from 2018, back when he was teammates with the human attached to Brendan Hartley's hair, who actually, in that race, became, until the Sakir Grand Prix last year, the best driver ever to take out Sergio Perez at turn 4. But as it happened, it was actually the other Uwu boy, Lando Norris, that took his second P4 in Bahrain, and his second in succession, as it's clearly one of his best tracks as well, and in the process, going round the outside of Pierre Gasly at turn 4 for the second time in 3 years. The domino effect of that allowed his teammate Daniel Ricciardo to also pass Pierre Gasly, and to be honest, I'm not really sure if it was just a lack of patience, or just a big misjudgment which resulted in him running into the car in front. Speaking of which, there isn't really that much to say about this. It's just a huge misjudgment from Sebastian in what felt pretty similar to the incident in Silverstone in 2019 with Max Verstappen. In both cases, I felt like Vettel was acting in anticipation that the driver in front of him would do something different to what they actually did, which is why in both cases he initially blames the other driver for not doing that thing. But when he watched it back, he's going to realise, like the rest of us, it's just crap driving. Now, I do have big concerns for Sebastian Vettel. Coming into Aston Martin, he didn't really make it all too clear what his goals were. Now, if it was to be the highest placed German in F1, then congrats, mission accomplished, only 1 attempt needed. But I rather hope that Sebastian is a little bit more ambitious than this. It's his first race for Aston Martin, yes, but mistakes like these aren't really something you can put down to not being used to the car yet. And the track we next go to is one where he has a 100% record of taking other drivers out. Right, now, that's the rest of the race covered. Should I talk about turn 4? I guess I probably should, shouldn't I? The big question here is this an illegal overtake? Yes, it absolutely is. In his defending from Verstappen, Hamilton uses the lapped Giovinazzi to his advantage by deliberately parking his car in the middle of the road, knowing that Verstappen can't go any further to the right because Giovinazzi's there. And by the time they both pass him, it's too late in the straight for Verstappen to make a move down the inside if he wants to. This effectively forces Verstappen to the outside, but because Hamilton is still in the middle of the road, there isn't enough space for Verstappen to try the switchback, effectively forcing Verstappen to go around the outside at turn 4, which he does, but illegally. There's no debating this, he goes off the track, and he hasn't been pushed off there by Hamilton. Verstappen goes off because he's carrying too much speed. He carries slightly too much speed that his rear tyres can't handle it, which causes him to lose the back end slightly, and that slight correction is what takes him outside the track. Now, while this move was the big talking point, and what everyone was focusing on as to the big reason Verstappen lost the race, but what was just as important in Verstappen losing that race is what he did afterwards. On the same lap, just after he let Hamilton through, he made a crucial mistake at turn 13, taking him out of DRS range from Hamilton, and by the time he got back into DRS zone, it was too late. To be honest though, Max shouldn't have even been behind Hamilton here in the first place. The place he should have let Hamilton through was here. It's not a realistic overtaking zone, so he isn't giving anything up in that sense. But it's still a long straight, so he can use the slipstream to make sure Hamilton doesn't get too far away, in time for him to mount another attack as they go on to the next lap. And even if he doesn't, he's still close enough to have another go as they go on to the next lap after that. But even so, at this point, he's still got a very good chance of winning the race. This is on lap 53, so 57 laps, there's still 4 laps to go. But he's got fresher tyres, so he can still use lap 54 to get back into the DRS zone, lap 55 to use the DRS zone to close back up to Hamilton, lap 56 to make him go defensive and set him up for a last lap. Hang on. Wait, what? There's only 56 laps. How is this possible? Because there was an extra formation lap at the start of the race, there were only 56 laps in this year's Bahrain Grand Prix, meaning that Verstappen would be denied a final chance to overtake Hamilton to win the race. I wonder which team was responsible in causing that formation lap. So if you add that to Max's mistakes and the problem he had with the differential, which may have cost him a fair amount of pace and resulted in a vastly different outcome, that is potentially 5 reasons Red Bull did not win the race. 4 of them in Red Bull's control, and any one of those not happening could well have resulted in Verstappen winning this first race. But Red Bull with reliability issues? No change there then. Unlike the rules in the middle of the race. Honestly, this whole track limits bollocks has been a complete shambles. Ever since they started actually making an effort to police it from the start of last year, and it's getting worse with every race weekend. There are so many issues with the track limits right now. I'm not going to explain all of them because honestly if I did, I'd probably be here until the next race weekend at Imola. But all I'll say is, while many football fans are complaining about VAR, I don't remember the FA changing the rules of football in the middle of a match, which is pretty much the equivalent of what the FIA did here. As I said before, I don't have an issue with Verstappen's pass on Hamilton being deemed illegal. My issue is the inconsistency, and why the same thing was not applied to Pierre Gasly last year at Silverstone, in what was pretty much an identical overtake to this one. And even more confusingly, why Valtteri Bottas was allowed to run wide at turn 4, and continued on to set the fastest lap that he was allowed to keep. The inconsistency with the stewarding at the moment in Formula 1 is absolutely amateur. Coming into this year, I already had serious doubts about Michael Massey's ability to perform the role of race director appropriately. And this is just the latest in a long line of incidents that have already happened in Massey's short career as F1 race director, including multiple drain covers coming loose, one of which destroying the floor of George Russell's Williams, and another causing serious injuries to Alex Peroni, a lack of sufficient recovery vehicles causing a red flag at Mugello, an Armco barrier that split in 2 did not do its job and nearly killed a driver. But for me, the worst one of all happened in the round before that in Istanbul. With the Williams of Nicholas Latifi spinning out in qualifying due to treacherous conditions, Michael Massey sent the cars back out for Q2 while the vehicle recovering the Williams was still on the track. Now, in case you didn't know, the last time a Formula 1 car collided with a recovery vehicle was in similar conditions to this, and it ended fatally. To allow that session to go ahead like he did, and then afterwards to say that he was more than comfortable with his actions, is disturbing to say the least. And these comments really should not be taken lightly. It's not my intentions to put a man down, but the reason I'm being so hard on him is because these are the drivers' lives that we're talking about here. I'm sorry for all the negativity, but seeing the Formula 1 race director making comments like these, it's just a bit disappointing. Almost as disappointed as you are when you realise you've watched basically the whole video and I haven't shown a clip of David Coulthard being caked once. As to who was doing the caking, well, that shows the Mercedes do not have the fastest car. It's quite clear that the issue with the Mercedes is their rear end. And if there's one track on the calendar that you don't want an unstable rear end, it's probably Bahrain. But that then begs the question, was this weekend the worst we'll see of Mercedes performance-wise? And will they now go a lot better at Imola, which is a circuit that has far fewer traction zones? So to be honest, this was the sort of race that suited both teams. Mercedes do not have the fastest car, but they might have it very soon, and they've shown they can still win races even when they don't. For Red Bull though, they do have the fastest car, and as I said before, there were 5 reasons that Max Verstappen didn't win the race, and just one of them not happening could have resulted in a victory. But that means that Red Bull only have to correct one thing to get a victory, and even if they don't, they'll still be in strong contention. If Mercedes thought they'd be struggling to follow and pass cars in Bahrain, one of the easiest tracks to overtake, what are they going to be like at Imola, one of the hardest tracks to overtake? Pierre Gasly could and probably should have finished 4th in Bahrain, but the AlphaTauri looks very strong, and Imola was probably their most competitive track last year. Last year, Gasly qualified in P4 and Kvyat finished there in the race, and if that trend continues, then Gasly might not be too far off the top 3 in a few weeks. All in all, the 2021 Formula 1 season is giving us all a lot of reasons to get very excited. Oh, you're still watching? Okay then, well, thank you for watching this video. This is obviously my first video on YouTube. I've had so many difficulties and problems in the making of this, which is why it's taken so long to make. I mean, I had nearly 3 weeks to make this video, and I've still only just got it out in time for the Imola Grand Prix tomorrow, which kind of says it all, really. And how do we think the race is going to play out tomorrow? Obviously Hamilton on pole, but remember what I said about Mercedes having 2 cars at the sharp end of the grid against just Verstappen for Red Bull. That's now going to be reversed because obviously Perez is in P2. He's on the soft tyres as well. Red Bull are splitting the strategy between the two, so that's going to make things very interesting. Bottas coming through the field as well. How far is he going to get up? Actually, I'm going to say right now, I don't think Valtteri Bottas is going to finish any higher than P5 tomorrow at Imola. Obviously, this is my first video on YouTube, hopefully the first of quite a few. I'm planning to do some more, so if you want to watch some of those, then you could consider subscribing. If you liked the video, you could consider leaving it a like. If you didn't like it, you could leave it a dislike. If you don't like me, you could leave a comment calling me an autistic prick. I won't get offended, but I will just ask you, if you think I'm an autistic prick, then why have you just watched about 17 minutes of my content? And finally, for the last time... I should have known.